Right, good afternoon. I think we will start, leaving the door open. My name is David Cadier. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in European Security at IRSEM, the Institute for Strategic Research of the École Militaire. And it is my great pleasure and in fact honor to be moderating today's discussion on the future of the European security order. Before I introduce our fantastic cast of speakers, let me briefly introduce the topic. European security is at a watershed moment, in case you hadn't been following the news in the past weeks or month. Europe is confronted to existential threats from the other sides of the Urals and to existential questions from the other side of the Atlantic. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is now in its third year and has basically given the death knell to the European security order, notably bearing in particular the Helsinki Accord, which we were supposed to celebrate the 50th anniversary this year. In Washington, we have a new US president who is now openly treating Europe as an adversary in trade affairs and as an annoying burden in security matters. We can discuss the pace, but the direction seems clear. We have to brace for a withdrawal from US guarantees or US from the European security architecture, and Europeans will be faced with the task of defending themselves. In this context, the same US president has started rounds of bilateral negotiations, most notably with Russia, where not only the Russia-Ukraine war is being discussed, but also broader matters pertaining to the European security architecture, though without the Europeans around the table. So what we would like to do today is to take stock of the moment we're in and the implications for Europe, to try to look into what could and should the European security order look like down the road, and what are the steps to be taken to attain these goals. In a way, the question is the following. If Europe were at the table of the aforementioned negotiations, what should Europe wish for, push for? What should be Europe's objectives and red lines? And to shed light on these questions, we are lucky to have three speakers with an amazing combined analytical, academic, and practical experience, judged by yourself. Starting on my left is Ambassador Pierre Vimont, who is Ambassador de France and a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. Ambassador Vimont had a distinguished career in both French and European diplomacy. Ambassador Vimont notably served as France's ambassador to the United States and to the European Union, as well as chief of staff to not less than three French foreign ministers. Ambassador Vimont was also the first Secretary General of the European External Action Service, the diplomatic service of the EU from 2010 to 2015, and served as a special envoy both to the President of the European Council and to the French President, including on matters pertaining to Russia. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us today. And then we have Dr. Olga Oliker, who is Program Director for Europe and Central Asia at the International Crisis Group, an independent non-profit and non-governmental organization specialized in research and analysis on conflict prevention and conflict resolution, among other things. Dr. Oliker is an expert on the foreign and security policies of Russia and Ukraine, on US policies towards the region, and on nuclear weapons strategy and arms control. Prior to joining the International Crisis Group, Dr. Oliker directed the Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, a think tank in Washington, as well as the Center for Russia and Eurasia at the RAND Corporation in Washington, and also at some point served at the US Department of Defense. Thank you, Dr. Oliker, for being here with us today. And last but not least, Dr. Hiski Okola, who is the director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, also known as FIA. And Dr. Okola is also an adjunct professor of international relations at the Tampere University in Finland, and a senior research associate at RAND Europe. Until spring 2024, Dr. Okola was the Secretary General and Chief of the Cabinet of the Office of the President of the Republic of Finland. Dr. Okola also served in position at the University of Turku, Tampere University, and the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, as you can see, I didn't lie about the wealth of expertise and experience we have on the panel today. And I would like to start, as I mentioned, with taking stock of the moment we're in, right? And I would like, Olga, if you don't mind, to start with you as the American on the panel. If you could tell us what is basically happening in Washington right now. How would you, you have 5 minutes, right? No, more seriously, how do you read the US policy shift on Ukraine? What is the nature of this shift? What is the extent of this shift? What are the drivers of this shift? And where do you see that going for the US, but also for Ukraine? So if you don't mind, I would like to start with you, Olga.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Is this on? Do I need to do something? I have a PhD from MIT. I don't know how to turn on my microphone.
It's in nuclear weapons, right? So if we find nuclear weapons, we'll ask you to operate them. That's
right. Thank you. I don't know how to operate them. I just know how to target them. Okay. So, no, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here on this excellent panel, which I hope to learn a great deal. As to what I can offer in explaining the United States, I'd like to keep your expectations low. The Trump administration, let me talk first about how it seems to be working. There are a variety of views, as near as I can tell, and I think as is evidenced from interviews that you can read from various administration officials. There are a variety of views on European security represented in the administration. However, one thing that is very consistent is that everyone who has joined this administration has joined under the condition that they will do what they are told by the president. So the president is setting the policy, and his advisors can advise, but they are not setting the policy. And the other thing that's very clear is that they don't all yet know quite what the policy is, which means that you get shifts in what different people at a variety of levels will tell you policies are, whether you're talking about Europe or Asia or the Middle East. The Trump administration's view of, I think, the way they view their approach globally is very much one of looking to America's interests. And looking at America's interests, I think they would agree from a fiscal standpoint of what is good for America's economy. Whether or not they are good at assessing what helps America economically or not remains to be seen by how their policies move forward. Certainly, they are taking an approach to what is good for America economically that diverges from past American administrations. The other thing that I think is very notable about this administration and related to this is they do think what all of their predecessors have been doing for quite a number of years is wrong, whether it comes to domestic policy, foreign policy, or quite simply how the US government works. So they are taking an approach of tear it down and then build whatever needs to be built in its place. And they are moving very rapidly to do these things. So we have seen the dismantlement of the US foreign assistance system, of longstanding US support for promotion of democracy, free press, et cetera, abroad. Really the way that the US engages on support in other countries, to other countries, whether that's humanitarian or whether it is with strategic intent. We've also seen a tremendous shift in American domestic policies and how the US responds to immigration to residents of the country, to people coming in and out, and of course, as many of you may have noticed, to trade and tariffs. When it comes to Europe, the administration, I think, comes from the perspective, which is a huge break with the past, that Europe is not that important to American security. Full stop. That the threats of instability or problems in Europe aren't really threats to the United States. That Europeans have been free riding on US security support. Now here, that's not a huge break with past administrations, but that the United States gets nothing out of it, which is a break from past administrations, right? Right, the story's been that the United States offers a lot in terms of security for its European allies, and what it gets is their support, their alignment, and a lot of the infrastructure that makes this possible. What this administration says is, we don't need you, and we don't care if you need us that much. And when it comes to Ukraine and European security, I think the message very much has been, Ukraine doesn't look to us to be that important to European security. Europe isn't that important to us. If the European countries think Ukraine is important, it's up to them to do whatever it is they're going to do about it. And as to our commitments to Europe, we're in the process of revisiting each and every single one of them one by one, but our a priori assumption is that it's not that important. You'd have to prove to us that it is. That could change, and again, I think there is a diversity of views within this administration on many of these issues, but I do think that is where the president and the vice president appear to be coming from.
Great, thank you very much, Faria. We'll certainly come back on these questions, but having been based in DC for so long, seeing the administration from inside, I think is very valuable. Thank you, Iski. If we could turn to you, maybe looking at how do you read Russia's reactions to this US policy shift? Again, when you were working with the president of Finland, admittedly you've been on calls with the Russian president, and you've been working on Russia as an academic for years as well. How do you read the way Russia is behaving in this moment? What it is trying to achieve and hoping to gain, maybe from this context?
Yeah, thank you, David. And first of all, I would like to just say thank you for the invitation. I'm so happy to be back in Paris, and so amazingly proud to be part of this amazing panel. And also, as a personal disclaimer, despite my fancy former titles, I speak in a personal capacity and do not reflect official Finnish positions. I'm not entitled to do that anymore. So how do I read Russia's reactions? I think they are ecstatic. They can't believe their luck. I think that must be the starting point. I mean, they have been given a huge gift and a huge boon by this new American administration. The diplomatic isolation is broken. They are back on the high table of international politics, and I think this already is a significant achievement for the Russians. They also, I think, they still see a path to victory when it comes to Ukraine, and that's why they keep persisting, both waging the conflict, but also when it comes to these discussions, they still want and aim to achieve everything. They want to control and dominate Ukraine. They want to revisit and re-engage the sort of the declarations or the documents they put forward in December 2021. And for them, in a way, the sky is still the limit. And I think they see an opening to achieve a lot of this. And I think this is the starting point to the situation that they are approaching. At the same time, I think it would be foolish and erroneous to say that they expect that they will get everything that they want, and that it's going to be straightforward or easy, or that they necessarily trust the Americans in any shape or form. I think on the contrary, the reverse is the case. There is a lot of distrust when it comes to the Americans, and I would say there is also a lot of animosity towards the Americans for the decades of perceived mistreatment, which probably animates Mr. Putin Putin personally in particular, the sort of the felt slights and sort of so many broken promises as he sees that, I think there will be very little faith and sort of expectation or trust, which probably entails that some kind of a grand bargain is probably not necessarily in the offing. And that's probably not even what the Russians are after. But if they can get it, they would be more than happy to pocket any and any sort of a concession or a deal provided by the Americans, especially if it is done on the expense of the Ukrainians and the Europeans. I think the main motivation probably for the moment is that Putin will dance. He has accepted the sort of the call from the US side, not perhaps in very concrete hopes of getting a sort of a radical breakthrough and agreement, as I said, but in full realization that every movement on the dance floor with the Americans wreaks very difficultly repairable damage to European security architecture, to transatlantic relations and trust. So I think what he is already pocketing and also sort of banking on is that this is a process after which he will be faced with a transformed European security landscape, with less trust over the Atlantic, with less cohesion in NATO. And these are, I think, the final and the grand prizes that he is after. And I think that's why the Russians are eager to play ball. They are eager to sort of entertain all of these discussions, and they want to milk this particular cow to the full, even if this complete deal and package might not be in the offing.
Thank you very much, Eski. This is very clear and a lot also to pick up from that. Pierre, how do you read Europe's reaction to this to this process and to this dynamics? What should the Europeans do and hope for in this context, in your view?
A lot, I guess. Yeah. Thank you, first of all, David, for inviting me with this prestigious panel. I'm quite honored to be on board. Quick few remarks following on what Olga and Essi have both said, and with which I totally agree. I think Europeans are caught somewhere in a very difficult place between a US policy that is moving away from their traditional posture, and Russia, which is more and more obstinate in its obsession with Ukraine. And for the Europeans, therefore, this is somewhat a moment of truth. And I still think personally, maybe I will beg to differ a little bit with what you said, David, at the beginning. The Europeans, maybe in full wishful thinking mode, are still hoping that what the kind of nightmare they're going through will not endure. In other words, what is happening at the moment in DC, in Washington, with the Trump administration has been very shocking, undoubtedly, and for the Europeans, the two main shocks have been G.D. Vance's speech in Munich and a kind of extraordinary shouting match in the Oval Office between Zelensky and the President and Vice President. Having gone over that and looking at the way things are unfolding at the moment on Ukraine, they see a little glimmer of hope from the European perspective. Namely, Trump's policy is not working. His idea of a ceasefire is not moving forward because Putin is not accepting an unconditional ceasefire. And everybody can see that the ongoing negotiations are getting more and more difficult. Hence, what we're witnessing in the last 24 hours. We hear now that Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff are about to come to Europe to discuss with their European colleagues. The French defense minister is going to Washington in the next few days to see Peter Hegseth. There seems to be a sudden need for dialogue on the American side with their European counterparts. So the whole question that the Europeans were asking themselves for the last 2 months or 3 months was, whether what is happening in New York, in Washington, is going to stay, and how we now have to live with this kind of chaotic, erratic U.S. foreign policy, or is there still a little bit of hope that this may change as we go on? Because this policy cannot work, and because, if anything else, we are in a very difficult situation. So this may be magical thinking, but my impression is that this is exactly where the Europeans are today. As always, some divisions among Europeans about this. There are those who are saying, no, this is going to stay. This new US foreign policy is going to last. And therefore, we have to live up to the reality and the challenge that we now are facing. And therefore, you hear all this ongoing story about the need to move quickly for European defense, a strong European industrial defense base, so on and so forth. And we may speak more about this later on. But you have those who are saying, of course, we have to go into that direction, but we need a transition, and for that we need the support of the Americans. So let's not close the door. Let's keep the bridge open with our American friends, and let's hope that a more realistic approach will slowly come out of Washington. And I think with regard to the Ukrainian crisis, there are two main issues that the Europeans have to tackle very quickly. The first one is how to bring back Ukraine on the US agenda. Because from what I can gather, listening to what we can hear coming out of Washington, is that Ukraine, in the form, in the shape of a quick ceasefire, was the most the Trump administration was ready to think about. The real issue of the ongoing discussion with Putin is a reset of the bilateral relationship with Russia, namely how to move on with relaunching an economic cooperation, political cooperation, discussing on many other issues, perhaps among them a new European security order, who knows, going back to those discussions on strategic stability, the ones that took place before the last Russian offensive in Russia. But I think this was the main goal of the Trump administration. They may be moving slowly, and that may be the moment when the Europeans will manage in their discussions with the Americans to bring back Ukraine on the forefront of the US diplomatic agenda in their discussion with Russia. But we're not there yet, and the next conversation we're going to have with our American counterparts could be quite interesting. And the second issue is for the Europeans to start thinking about what would be for them the best endgame of this Ukrainian conflict. In other words, the conversation that the Europeans among themselves never managed to have and were not really eager to have, because they're pretty much divided. This is when they have to discuss all the different paradigms or parameters, let's put it that way, of a peace settlement for Ukraine. Membership of NATO, the annexed territories, what do we do with them? Neutrality status for Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, so on and so forth. Now you could add also the whole issue of lifting of sanctions, as we hear more and more inside the American administration telling us that if they manage to get an agreement to relaunch bilateral relationship with Russia, they would start thinking about lifting their own US sanctions. And one can be quite assured that the pressure on the Europeans will be very strong on behalf of the Americans. And then you hear also some hint from the Russian side on the need for new elections, presidential elections in Ukraine as soon as possible to try to get rid of Zelensky. These are the real issues. And these are the issues that the Europeans have so far been not too enthused about discussing among themselves. Much divergence about how to behave on this, how to move ahead on this. The realistic the realistic member states against those who are still hoping for a strategic defeat of Russia. But if we want to be able to discuss in a useful way with our American counterparts, and even if at some stage we want to have a seat at the negotiating table, these are the issues we need to discuss among ourselves. And the Europeans are somewhat uneasy with those issues and not, I think, at the moment, ready to engage in a thorough discussion and exchanging among themselves on these issues.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Well, actually, let's do it now. I think these are great questions indeed.
Should have shut up.
No, to go back to... No, I mean, I would really like to hear the three of you and go a bit more in the details of this negotiation process. Indeed, in terms of best possible outcomes for Europe. Again, if we were to send a policy memo to Marco Rubio and see Witkoff coming in Europe, what can we hope for? What are the... is there any possibility of a compromise? What are the most problematic issues? Pierre, you've listed them, right? There are several on the table. Territory, neutrality, demilitarization, accountability also. There's quite a number. Which one, in your view, are the biggest points of contention? And also, what are the scenarios? I think I understood from your three perspectives is that you're not too hopeful that these negotiations will lead to something like a major breakthrough. What happens when they fail, in your view? So maybe we can go in the reverse order and start with you, Pierre.
Let me start, and I'll try to put some order in my own reflections, because I think this is a very difficult question that you put, David, and a very interesting one. What do we have at the moment if we look at most recent statements on the US side and on the European side? On the US side, I detect one or two strong statements. The first most obvious one is no NATO membership for Ukraine. That's the first one. I would add a second one, and I think even in Kiev, I'm talking about under Olga's control, who know much more what's happening in Kiev. But I understand that even in Kiev, they understand that there will be no additional military assistance from the US for the time coming. I mean by that, a new package of military assistance that could be voted by the Congress and decided by this US administration. If you go one step further, you have among the parameters, you have, as we have heard from Steve Witkoff and maybe a few others, that the territories currently occupied and annexed by Russia are there to stay. Whatever will be their status at the end of the day, formal recognition or de facto recognition, but there is this idea that it's very difficult to change that situation on the ground. And it seems to me that from there on, it's on the other side, on the European side, that we can look at some other aspects of this broad picture. Europeans have said time and again that they don't want to hear about a demilitarized Ukraine, and they intend to go on supporting militarily Ukraine. So I think that is something that is important to keep in mind. Secondly, this is a parameter that is not always there, but I think you have to put it there, that they will go on with sanctions and they will never lift their sanction unless there is a clear-cut, fair peace settlement at some stage. They haven't said much about neutrality, and they haven't said much for the time being about accountability or some other issues. So I think this is where the conversation between the US and the Europeans have to start. Now, as I was telling you before, you still have inside the European Union a group of countries that are still don't want to get involved into that kind of discussion, and will say rather sharply, think about the High Representative, Mrs. Callas, will go on saying we can defeat Russia. Russia can be defeated. So this talk about starting to think about a balance, a peace deal, is something that she would say, I don't want to get involved in. So we have to be aware of that. And personally, I'm not entirely sure that for the time being the Trump administration is ready to go all that far in discussing all these different elements of a possible peace deal, because they know they may lose a lot of time, and they may know, as you were rightly saying, David, that there is no good way out of this kind of conversation with the Russian president. Because at the end of the day, if you look at what he calls the root causes of the conflict, for Russia, the root cause of the conflict is Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian state. So this is a major blocking issue that nobody knows how to solve. So the real point, in my opinion, and I will end there, is that are we ready to go for a peace deal that only will be half-baked and that will not bring the full-fledged stability, strategic stability we're looking for? Or are we ready to go for a somewhat peace deal that will not be satisfactory, but at least maybe will open the way for the time being to the end of the conflict per se. I think that's the real issue that we're facing at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, let's go to whiskey. We go the reverse order, and Odia, you have the last word on that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Difficult question and a nasty surprise from the chairman. I would approach and this is probably a small state perspective also to a certain extent with the history that Finland has had. So this is not something that can only be approached from the vantage point of strategic stability and bird-eye view, which is necessary and important, but not entirely perhaps sufficient, nor necessarily always just enough. And I think the way I've been thinking about this topic for a little while now is that we should aim, us Europeans, hopefully the Americans as well. I think it would be very, very important that they were part of this conversation and part of the solution and not part of the problem going forward, is that we should aim for the best possible future for Ukraine. That should be our starting point. And that implies at least two things. First of all, it implies a certain dose of realism. And this is important as well. So we are not talking about the ideal future for Ukraine or not necessarily even the future for Ukraine as they have spelled it out for themselves in the peace formula. I attended many of the NSA meetings in the peace formula context, and I was always, of course, we were politically supportive of the process and played our role, and I think it was the right thing to do. But personally, I always had serious reservations whether the whole program was ever realistic to begin with, especially when we were having this conversation in a situation where the war was still raging on and was essentially undecided. So I think there needs to be an element of realism, and therefore we need to aim at not the ideal but the best possible future for Ukraine. But in addition to realism, that entails a lot, or I would even say the maximum choice for Ukraine that we and they can afford. And this is important as well, that it's not a deal that is negotiated over their heads or imposed on them, or a deal that is forced upon them through some kind of a military victory achieved by Russia because we fail to give them support and the time that perhaps they need. And I think in minimum, when we think about it, this entails that Ukraine needs to have security, it needs to have independence, it needs to have the opportunity for indigenous development, and I think it needs to have a European perspective. And anything beyond that, of course, is additional and plus. But as we live in a political reality where the Americans have already said that NATO accession will not be on the table, maybe I do not include this on the list as of now, but I do still include the European perspective on the list. The problem with this is that none of these things are accepted by Russia. They will not allow or give Ukraine security, independence, the right for indigenous development, and they most probably over time will not condone their European perspective. So the question coming back to us is, what are we going to do about this? And this is not just a conversation we need to have amongst Europeans and Europe, and even with the Americans. This is also a conversation we need to have with the Russians. I don't necessarily agree with High Representative Kallas. I think it's a very maximalist position and probably not very realistic. But I think we need to be in a position to make forceful arguments if we are serious about this program. If we want to have some kind of another arrangement, that is a separate conversation, but this is how I see it. In the minimum, and I think this is really the minimum, we need a situation where Russia does not prevail. And I think this should be the bare minimum. And also, I think it would be very, very helpful that we had a strong Ukraine, militarily and security-wise strong Ukraine going forward. I think we need it for military security and stability in Europe. And I think we need it also to showcase to the Russians that the use of force does not, cannot, and will not pay.
Very precise list, actually. So thank you very much, Hiski, for that.
I used to be a policy planner working for the Finnish.
Yeah, I remember that. So that's how you were not surprised at all, actually. Olja, how do you see this whole process unfolding?
So when I think back to fall of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, those of us who were pretty confident the Russians were going to invade were also pretty confident that the Russians were going to succeed. And that included most of the Ukrainians I talked to. In fact, I had a really interesting conversation with a Ukrainian friend who'd come to visit me in Brussels in February of 2022. We agreed that the Russians were going to invade her country. And I said, okay, so you need to go home, get your husband and child, and come back here. You can stay with me as long as you need to. And she said, oh, no, I'm going to go back and fight. And I said, you just told me that you're going to lose. And she said, I can't look my daughter in the face if I don't fight. So, the Ukrainians were in this because they didn't think they had a choice. They wanted to look their children in the face, but they didn't think they were going to succeed. As for the rest of us, we thought that it was going to be very sad. We were going to lose, the Ukrainians were going to lose, and NATO was going to circle wagons. Russia would be emboldened. An emboldened Russia would be more dangerous. It would test Article 5. And NATO's job was going to be to protect NATO. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, terribly sorry, right? You couldn't get anyone to say that, but I mean, how else does this work? And then it turned out that the Russian military wasn't as good as it thought it was, and therefore it wasn't as good as we thought it was, because we believed their own assessment of their own capabilities, and that was a mistake. And that opened up a different opportunity, right? It opened up space where you could show the Russians that indeed force doesn't work, it doesn't pay, that this is harder than you think it is. And you could therefore build a more secure Europe. So the question, you've had this Europe that goes from feeling pretty secure to feeling very insecure, oh my God, the Russians could attack any of us, to thinking, okay, there's space to actually come back to feeling more secure if you can constrain Russia. Weaken it militarily, weaken it through sanctions, and show it that it can't win the war. So here we are, more than 3 years later, and the Russians look like they could succeed. Succeed less, right? They have been shown that conquest isn't as easy as you think it is. They have, I think, had it demonstrated to them that the Ukrainians don't like them very much and will fight. What I don't think they fully understand is that the European countries that have backed Ukraine really do see them as a threat and are poised to continue to do so. So we are, what does this security environment look like? What's the best case for Europe, right? I think the best case for Europe is a Russia that, for whatever reason, does not want to test its luck further, right? Because it may not want to test its luck further because it thinks it will fail. It may not want to test its luck further because it thinks it would cost it. I don't, frankly, as somebody said, they should get over their imperialism. I don't care why, right? I just care that they're constrained. And you think about policies to do this. But another big difference between late 2021, early 22, and right now is the United States. Because if the United States is not part of European deterrence and assurance, if Europe has to do it on its own, then there's a lot of thinking, planning, and buying of weapons that has to go into this that hasn't been developed before. So, arguably, there are a few ways this is easier. One way it's easier is if the war continues, because the Russians are tied down if the war continues. Another way it's easier is if Ukraine is sovereign and well-armed and capable, because the Russians are nervous about it and maintain some resources to the end of keeping Ukraine contained. Also useful for everybody else. A not so good outcome is if the Russians are able to redeploy all of their forces to where they can threaten other European countries. Look, I'm not worried about Russian tanks in Paris. I'm not even really all that worried about Russian tanks in Tallinn. I am worried about the Russians pointing to their tanks and saying, there are things I want from you. Don't forget our tanks, right? And when I say tanks, I, in many cases, mean aircraft and boats and things. So all of this it's complicated and it's hard to get. So I would say when Russia talks about the root causes of the conflict, independent Ukraine is one of them, but the European security order that emerged from the Cold War is the other. The Russians feel that to be secure, they need to dominate their neighborhood, right? The Russian theory of how to attain security is by dominating the countries around them and being able to coerce other countries. And I'm not saying this in a normative, they're bad guys way. I'm just saying if you read what the Russians say about how security works, that is how they think security works. So if you're these countries and you don't want to be coerced, you want to limit Russia, and you've got a security dilemma, right? The things that the other countries of Europe think make them more secure make Russia less secure. A peace deal in Ukraine is not going to solve this problem. The best a peace deal in Ukraine can do is mitigate some of it. But the problem stays whatever happens next in Ukraine. And I would say the Americans want a ceasefire because they know this is complicated and they don't want to get involved in it. The one thing that the Russians and the European countries backing Ukraine agree on is that that's inadequate.
You mean so a ceasefire as opposed to a peace deal? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it seems that the difference between the US, Ukrainians and the European on the one side is to say, first let's get a ceasefire and then we can talk about a peace deal. What Russia is saying, let's first get a peace deal and then we can talk about ceasefire, right? That's, yeah.
Basically, but I would also say that the Ukrainians had to be coerced into agreeing to a ceasefire.
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue that a ceasefire is in Ukraine's interest because it could use the break to train personnel and get gear in place and so forth, but they had to be, coerced into it. And I would also say, look, we talk about arming Ukraine in perpetuity. There will be no additional American arms shipments. Will there be a continuation of American intelligence support? Because if there's not, it's going to take a little while for Ukraine's other transatlantic backers, and I say transatlantic because we don't want to forget the Canadians, to make up for what the Ukrainians are getting from the United States. And whether Ukraine continues to fight the war or whether Ukraine has to somehow survive whatever peace deal emerges, but it emerges sovereign, it's got to get intelligence from somewhere.
So actually, from all your points, I retain something, is that there's the dynamic of the Russia-Ukraine war, which is embedded into a bigger problem about European security, and that there needs to be, in a way, to have conversations about both. So maybe we looked at the first. Let's look a bit at the second before we open up for questions and comments from the audience. Precisely, what needs fixing about the European security order would probably keep us until tomorrow. So you can tackle this question as you want. But what kind of frameworks? What should be the institutions? What should be the underpinnings, or even just the kind of discussions that we can think of in terms of addressing this broader European security problem? Because as was mentioned, it seems that Russia has been, in a way, using Ukraine to force a discussion, if not a revision of the European security order. What is the way to, in a way, provide a kind of deterrence that you called for? What is the way to mitigate also risks of escalation? I'm mentioning that, and I'm happy to have all three of you, because you recently published reports on these issues, right? Two of these reports, one coordinated by Olya and another authored by Pierre a couple of months ago. You have the links on the webpage for this event, so you can go back and read the reports in detail. And I think it's key also thinking about these issues of broader European security architecture, right? So do you want to start, actually, Hiski? Let's go this way, and then we'll...
If that's how it has to be. Yeah, I think this is a very important question. But it's also an empirical question, basically depending on the outcome of the war. And I'm not trying to be cute here, but because I think this is really a sort of an important point in its own right. And this is sort of me channeling a little bit of international relations theories here. But I think one way to think about security orders is that they're basically moments in time crystallized at the end of wars or other periods of punctuated equilibrium. And in order to get there, you basically need to have a little bit of certainty or a little bit of understanding about the outcome, because the eventual order will reflect the sort of the power dispersion and the ideas and values of those who are basically strong enough to enact and effect an order. And we of course have different sort of historical experiences of how this can come about, but quite often it is the victors after a war who more or less impose the sort of the desired order upon the others. And I don't think this depends on my views, so I don't think it is necessarily very fruitful for me to spell out what kind of a vision I would like to have. I think the fact of the matter and the important question is that this is still an open one. And so it invites everyone who is interested in the outcome to think about what is the role of our agency to affect this process and to ensure that we get to as happy a place as possible after the sort of the dust has settled. I think we can think of three different options here. The first one, and barring a fantastical collapse of Russia, which I do not think is in the offer, I think it seems safe to say that some kind of a reactivation, a full reactivation of the OSCE principles is not on the cards. I think this seems like a safe thing to say. And of course our problem in terms of policy is that this is still the formal objective. This is still the one we are discussing about, and for good reasons. Because saying anything else officially could be construed as a concession, but at least as an intellectual exercise, I think we need to think of other alternatives as well. I think the most likely scenario is that even after the war, however it will be terminated, we will be dealing with a belligerent and resentful Russia that will be unhappy most probably with the outcome, still capable of doing all kinds of things in this world, some of them nasty, some of them hopefully less so. But I think we will be dealing with a rather dangerous and menacing Russia going forward. And so the other possible scenario, if the OSCE principles is not the one, is that we will have sort of not a security architecture in any meaningful sense, but we will have a rather sort of blunt balance of power based on military forces and deterrence. And this will imply, hopefully, and it can be a sort of in a military sense, rather stable setting, but also very costly, because it means that everyone will be investing into the armed forces, doing a lot of these kind of things. And of course, whether we can keep the US aboard this kind of an entity is an important question in its own right. But it also most probably means that there will be lots of gray area activities, hybrid sort of lots of other paranormal activities taking place in Europe. And it will be a pretty nasty setting for European security. If you could talk about, in a sense, European asecurity in this kind of a setting. In this analysis, I think the best option could be trying to find some kind of a modus vivendi with Russia. Not probably based on any clear-cut rules or agreements or principles or architectures, but just coming up with a list of do's and don'ts. Things you do and things you refrain from. And this will need to be a sort of a reciprocal exercise where you, perhaps through trial and error, some tacit bargaining, which never needs to be uttered out aloud, but with sort of clever people can suss them out, will result in a more stable situation, which I think is in the interest of all. So even a word such as confidence building is probably too ambitious for this kind of a world. But some kind of do's and don'ts, as I said. Two things here. One thing that we need to take into consideration is the countries in between. There will always be countries in between, at least for the foreseeable future. And they will be a source of potential friction and conflict, and they need to be managed very carefully, hopefully by both sides. But we can't rely on the good offices and the good faith on the part of Russia, most probably. So this will be a sort of a policy challenge for Europeans and hopefully also the Americans going forward. And countries in between, they will have their own agency as well. They will be not just objects of our policies, but subjects and actors in their own right. And this will complicate a lot of things going forward. And finally, and this is where I began, Europe has and needs to have a lot of agency in this conversation. And therefore I welcome Pierre's sort of invitation for us to have these discussions and get serious about this and try to foster as much as common vision and purpose so that we can play the role that I think we need to play going forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you. I think I agree with all of that, but I think it's also important to ask about a third scenario, right? Which is that Russia succeeds in Ukraine in the sense that it gets the vassal state it wants, right? And or that Russia fails in Ukraine and the war continues for a bit, but either through the war continuing or after, the Europeans don't get their deterrence act together because the Americans are out, because voters don't want to spend money that way, because there are divides amongst different countries with different views. So what happens then? Right, but it's a nasty world, but I feel we should describe the nasty world because I think for a lot of voters and some members of parliament across the transatlantic space, they ask what's wrong with that world. Who cares? Are there tanks rolling in, as I said earlier? Okay, so what if Russia dominates its neighborhood? Russia dominated its neighborhood for centuries with different definitions of Russia and different definitions of neighborhood. So, look, I can lay out a story of what's wrong with this world. But it's a complicated story. It's not as simple as tanks, right? It's about freedom and regulation and the ability to start a business and have protections for that business if somebody wants to raid it. It's about having a system that is based in rule of law. It's apparently a really tough sell these days to voters, that this is important and that this is valuable and this is useful. Because I think that's the danger, right? That's the nasty world. The other piece of the nasty world is that might makes right, and stronger countries do what they will and weaker ones do as they must. But again, you can just say that that's the normal order of things, right? Historically, that's how it's worked. So these last years were an aberration, right? You can make this argument. I come from a conflict prevention organization, so I don't make that argument. I make an argument about evolution but you can hear this. So I do think we need to do, those of us who believe in a better world, and a better world is the deterrence-based order that Iskia described, right? A better world is a world where Russia, yes, it's aggrieved. Russia is always aggrieved. If your theory on how to attain security requires dominating and coercing the countries around you, you are always going to be frustrated and you're going to be impossible to reassure. So that's the Russia. You have to manage that Russia in perpetuity if you are the neighbors. That's expensive. So you have to sell it. Yeah, you could make it cheaper with some arms control deals or formal or informal, but it's expensive. And I don't know, so I think this is the challenge, is actually explaining that last scenario of what we're worried about, why we're worried about it, and why voters and MPs and politicians who want to get elected should spend resources to avoid that future.
Thank you, Olya.
Maybe a quick additional thoughts on what has been said by both of you, with which I very much agree, of course. Let's take what I think we can all agree could be perhaps the only realistic option in terms of some kind of peace settlement, which would mean balance of power, as you were saying. I would call it, I don't know, unstable coexistence or something of that sort, which means that each side will have to make concessions, right? Which means that Russia will not have got all it wanted. So that will be a very unstable situation, a very fragile peace deal. And how do we handle this on the European side? Two thoughts there. First one is about the American shadow about all of this. Will the US be part of that kind of peace deal, or will they have gone on their own way, as we were talking about it before? Namely, having their own bilateral relations with Russia and leaving the Europeans with the need to take care of Ukraine and go ahead with this kind of peace deal we can manage to arrange. How does this double track security order in Europe would work? Because I'm sure if the US goes ahead with its own understanding or negotiation or partnership with Russia, strategic stability will be part of that deal. What are they going to do as a follow-up to New START, those strategic agreements, maybe more than that, Open Sky, I don't know, INF, air defense missile, etc., etc. anti-ballistic missiles defense, so on and so forth. So where do the Europeans stand with regard to this? And the second one, coming back to the point you were making, David, about formats. If the European security order is left to the Europeans, who will be in charge? Who will be the powers in charge? Who will negotiate that? As you were rightly saying, I don't see the OSCE for the time being. It couldn't be an institution. It should be some kind of a ad hoc format. And I think it will be something coming out of this coalition of the willings to some extent. Which brings me to my last point, is that what we may be witnessing, at least in the field of security and defense and foreign policy in general, is maybe a new reshaping of the European Union as it was up to now. And that brings, of course, a lot of questions about then, if we agreed that this will be a coalition of the willing, a much more flexible European Union, or let's say a new ad hoc a European gathering of countries that are ready to go ahead together, how do they manage to make all European nations respect what they have agreed on? Namely, there is a risk in this kind of very fragile peace agreement, very uncertain stability, that many European countries will decide to, go on their own and try to make the best of the situation. I find it fascinating that we've started hearing again in Berlin people talking about reopening Nord Stream 2 as in the recent weeks, with, by the way, US businessmen coming in and saying this is exactly what should be done. So let's not forget that human nature can be very surprising in many ways, and that we may facing this kind of dislocated European Union with which, of course, Russia will play. And we have to be very much aware of that. So the risk, if we are being realistic, is that we're going to get that kind of peace deal, and that we will get that kind of geopolitical situation in Europe, which will not be a security order, but will be a way of managing in the best way possible a very unstable, insecure geopolitical situation for some time to come.